Hi folks, it's Michael Weisser, staff reporter for Cannabiz News, and I am absolutely enthralled to welcome you to this week's episode of the Keith Stroup Show. It's our weekly update on the politics of marijuana. The star of our show launched the entire marijuana movement back in the 70s as the founder of NORML, and he's still there fighting in the trenches in Washington, D.C. You know I'm talking about Keith Stroup. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very special episode for you. Joining us this week from Denver, Colorado, just flew in, his arms are short-tired, is another of the country's most respected cannabis lawyers. Our special guest this week is Mr. Bob Hoban from the Hoban Law Group. Thanks for coming in. How's everybody doing?
Doing great, Michael. Thanks for the invitation and the warm welcome. And Keith, always great to be on with you. So thanks and good morning.
Yeah, nice to have you, Bob.
Where was it, by the way, that you flew in from, Bob?
But believe it or not, I was in Houston, Texas, and you might say, what's a cannabis lawyer doing in Houston, Texas? There is a movement afoot in Texas, and it's kind of like the old Wayne Gretzky theory: watch where the puck is going, not where it's at. And the puck is certainly going there. We worked with a congressman who's challenging Ted Cruz by the name of Beto O'Rourke, who has presently tied in the polling with Ted Cruz for that senatorial election of November 2018. So pretty exciting opportunity.
He's out of El Paso, right?
He is, and he's a good friend of the cannabis industry, and we help them understand some things that are happening across the states, and it was really exciting to be there.
Well, it's been a fantastically busy week in marijuana scene, as usual. Among the headlines, you guys, there was High Times has been sold for the first time since it was founded in 1974. Veterans Affairs Secretary David Shulkin made headlines when he caved to the American Legion pressure to provide access for veterans who have PTSD. An Obama-era drug warrior, the former drug czar Thomas McClellan, revealed that Michael Botticelli had actually wanted to decriminalize cannabis but couldn't get it done. The Secret Service admitted that they're probably actually secret smokers in addition to being Secret Service. And then 29 different states had some sort of update. Well, 28 states and Guam. Got to give Guam their credit. All that aside, yesterday, Mr. Bob Hoban, you were making national news yourself. The DEA moved to throw out your lawsuit about marijuana extracts. Now, I read a little bit about the case this morning on Ganjapreneur, but it left me with several questions. Among the things I'd like to know, what is a controlled substance number? What's your case about? And why is the DEA trying to overrule the Farm Bill?
Great questions. So in December of last year, the DEA comes out with this drug code called marijuana extract, drug code 7350. Why there are drug codes is so that the DEA can both track drug consumption of controlled substances being the key here, number one. And number two, if you're a DEA registrant, you're a researcher, you're a university, you're a pharmacy, you order controlled substances by this 4-digit drug code. So when they came out with this marijuana extract code, they wrote it in such a broad fashion that it basically encompassed things that are not controlled substances. And that was the basis for the suit. And that's really why you have these drug control numbers. So the drug control number, 7350, for marijuana extract basically began to treat cannabinoids themselves as controlled substances when they're not designated as controlled substances under the Controlled Substances Act. More importantly, it broadened the definition of what's an illegal or controlled substance from marijuana to cannabis. For those that know, it's not necessarily a legal technicality, but the definition under the Controlled Substances Act that criminalizes parts of cannabis is marijuana, not cannabis.
With an H.
Marijuana with an H, no less. Marijuana. So you've got this marijuana extract code, which if something comes out of marijuana, it's certainly illegal federally. Marijuana, however, is not the entire cannabis plant. In fact, it's not the entire cannabis species. But let's focus on the plant itself. The flowers, the leaves, the stems, or viable seeds, all of those things would be deemed a controlled substance under the definition of marijuana with an H. But the rest of the plant has always been exempted from marijuana, the definition. So cannabis is not illegal, marijuana is illegal, and that's where the DEA got off track on this drug code definition. Because while it's called marijuana extract, they've defined it to include the entire cannabis plant. And that's the fundamental basis for the challenge. So twofold. Number one, marijuana is illegal, not cannabis. Number two, cannabinoids are not unlawful substances per se. However, they can be if they come from the parts of the plant that are deemed marijuana. And let's not forget, cannabinoids also come from at least 25 other species of plant.
Including chocolate, right?
Including chocolate, echinacea, so forth and so on, yeah.
Yes. So then their purpose of trying to lump cannabinoids into the definition of marijuana was basically to extend the prohibition. I thought that they claimed the controlled substance numbers were to help people do research.
Well, it's certainly associated with that. So it helps them track and helps researchers obtain controlled substances. But fundamentally, let's look at this. If I extract an oil from the stalk of a cannabis plant, the stalk is not defined as marijuana. Therefore, the stalk is not a controlled substance. And this is not something that's some sort of interpretation by our law firm. This is Ninth Circuit federal appellate case law from 2004 in the HIA versus DEA case. The Ninth Circuit determined that there are indeed exempted parts of the plant. And if you take extracts from those exempted parts of the plant, then they are not controlled substances, even if it contains elements of THC, the psychoactive substance, right? So cannabinoids that are present in things that are not quote-unquote marijuana are not illegal, and that's really the basis for this. Now, the reason that they enacted the drug code is so that they can effectively say anything that comes out of a hemp plant that they're going to treat as a cannabis plant, because it is a cannabis plant. Hemp, the legal distinction is it simply has that 0.3% or less THC. Anything that comes out of that hemp plant is a controlled substance. It's a marijuana extract. And they wanted to, basically send a chill through the CBD or the cannabinoid extract marketplace. And they've certainly successfully done that. But that's really what it's all about. Now, the good news is the DEA filed their response brief on Friday in this case. And while they do attack the case on procedural merits, they do not disagree with any substantive legal position that we've asserted. In other words, that if you extract it from stalks, cannabinoids are not illegal. Cannabinoids from other plants are not illegal. Cannabinoids from Farm Bill produced hemp are not illegal. So that's a big deal.
Wow. This is a very complex issue. I'm glad that we've got a hardcore lawyer like yourself working on it. How did you end up working in cannabis law in the first place?
That's a great question. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2005.
My sympathies.
Well, and it was a shocker to us at the time. The doc gave her about 6 months to live. I grew up in New Jersey. She lived in New Jersey. I moved her out to Colorado a couple weeks a month. She would do her chemotherapy in New Jersey. She'd come out and visit my family, my children, and me a couple weeks a month. In the process of doing that, I made her breakfast every morning before I'd go to work and gave her pills. And one morning I saw her taking one of her very powerful opioids to her mouth, and we had to track those, and this was what was prescribed. And I saw a big wad of drool come out of her mouth as she brought it to her lips. It was, plain and simple, it was addiction. She was addicted to this substance, and it just didn't sit well with me. Knowing a fair amount about marijuana myself, but knowing my mother wouldn't smoke it, I began to research our program here in Colorado that Keith and certainly a lot of folks are responsible for. Years before I got involved in this industry. And we were able to work with folks. There weren't dispensaries at the time. There were caregiver networks. So you basically called people and they would say on one end of the spectrum, hey, meet me at the 7-Eleven. I got the best stuff in town. Well, you'd note that, but you
don't want to do that with your mom.
That wasn't where I was going with my mom. And you couldn't
Right.
walk into a store. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it was, hey, why don't you come by and visit my wife and I? We've made a tincture or an oil or some sort of cracker. And that's basically how we got started helping my mom. And then 6 of those caregivers that produced and provided cannabis extracts for my mother, who, by the way, lived for 4.5 years with pancreatic cancer.
Instead of 6 months.
Instead of 6 months, and three of those years were opioid free. And I would also note, and this was long before I knew even a hair of what we know today about cancer treating properties, et cetera. So this was purely, for appetite and for pain relief. But long story long, we opened up 6 of those caregivers were 6 of the first dispensaries to open in the city of Denver back in 2009. And then on December 30th of 2009, we won a case against the city of Centennial, Colorado, which was the first case, as far as we can tell, in U.S. history, where an injunction was entered against a municipality who tried to shut down a dispensary on the basis of federal illegality. So from that point forward, our otherwise commercial practice, litigation, transactional work, real estate, regulatory work, we became all cannabis all the time on December 30th, 2009, and it's been a great road and no looking back.
Wow. So you have a great picture of the industry as a whole over this past decade, for sure, especially when it comes to hemp, CBD products, and how things are going in Colorado. What do you see as the future of American cannabis?
The good news is that there are political leaders in many of the Western states who are effectively sitting back and inviting the government to bring it on, and that's not something that we had even 2 years ago, where the governors of states and attorney generals in states would stand up and fight for that state. I mean, it seemed like many folks thought this was an experiment that may or may not succeed. And if there was any pushback from the federal government, I always got the impression that the states would effectively roll over and abandon or at least suspend their programs. That's not the case now, particularly as they're galvanized under this administration. Look at what California's done. They hired, obviously, our former U.S. attorney as a special advisor, and the state of Nevada has said, bring it on, in effect. And then we've got other states like Colorado, where they've recently sent a letter to the federal government saying, please, if you're considering a change in federal policy, please talk to us first. So at least there's the fact that the governments are beginning to rely on this revenue. They're beginning to stand up and back up the industry, and we didn't see that much not too many years ago. So that's a good sign, and that's frankly why I think the industry is here to stay.
What are you seeing, Keith?
Well, I certainly appreciate that there are people like Bob Hoban who are willing to continue to put the heat on the DEA. I have to tell you, as a little aside, that we first sued the DEA on similar issues, trying to reschedule marijuana in 1973. And it took us until 1988 to even get hearings on the petition, that we had to go to the appellate court about 6 times to force them to process it the way they were required to do legally. And even after the hearing examiner found marijuana to be one of the safest drugs ever known to man, the head of the DEA simply overruled him and said he thought it was based on side evidence, not solid medical evidence. Now, I guess my point in all of this is I think it's important that we keep the heat on in the legalization movement in every possible venue. But I will tell you personally, I'll be surprised if Bob is successful in this one, not because his arguments aren't valid, but because he's dealing with the DEA. And our experience has been they will ignore science, they will ignore truth, and they will run it the way they want. Now, one other thing. I kind of agree with Bob that you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And it seems to me that we have come too far, even if the hardliners take control for a few years on the federal level. I can't see them stopping the legalization movement. But I will say I don't have an absolute certainty in my mind about that because of people like Jeff Sessions. I mean, a man who would literally say recently, when he was still senator, good people don't smoke marijuana. I mean, we're dealing with an ignorant man, and he's got the power, if he chose to go into federal court and seek an injunction to shut down the commercial cultivation and commercial sale. Now, hopefully he won't, and I'm like Bob, I really think the fact that the governors of these states are now standing up and saying, we're not going to take this lying down, we're going to fight this. So, I am hopeful that the Trump administration will go off and muck up some other area and leave ours alone, but I'm not comfortable. I worry every day that we may feel the worst of the session's bias.
This week's episode of the Keith Stroup Show is sponsored by the Hoban Law Group. The nation's premier cannabis law firm, Hoban Law, is also the nation's only full-service cannabis business law group. Formed in 2009, Hoban Law has been Colorado's largest, most experienced cannabis business law firm and consistently provided expert commercial legal advice to its clients in the regulated marijuana dispensary system and the industrial hemp sector. As the burgeoning movement has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, HLG has grown with it. Now home to a national footprint of attorneys licensed in over a dozen states across the country, with the expertise to offer its clients one-stop shop for their rapidly expanding business legal needs. Call the Hoban Law Group at 303-674-7000 or visit them online at Hoban Law. That's HOBAN.law. Speaking of governors and state governments standing up for their cannabis industries, a couple of weeks ago we reported on a bill that Governor Hickenlooper of your state, Bob, recently signed that says Colorado hemp farmers can't be denied access to federal water. Now, I'm not sure what the details are in this case, but just hearing that makes it seem like we're setting up for a court challenge in the future.
Well, here's what happened in Colorado. So in Colorado, because we're an arid western state, water is controlled by a number of either private or sort of quasi-public, quasi-private entities called ditch companies. And those ditch companies effectively would shut down water access because the water was coming, so for example, from a federally controlled reservoir. And they'd say hemp farmers cannot use this water. It wasn't the federal government that was saying specifically, you cannot use this water, don't take it, although that was probably certain to come or certainly happening behind the scenes. But it was these ditch companies, these water companies that were saying you can't use this because it's federal water and hemp's illegal. And we tried on multiple occasions to convince these folks that it wasn't an illegal substance and that the state program for hemp was legal and that it was compliant with federal law. And we were able to convince some of those folks to release the water, but others basically shut down farmland. Farmers who spent a lot of money on seed and or, believe it or not, tens of thousands of hemp clones to plant their fields because the access to seeds is so difficult in the U.S. Long story long, this is what prompted the legislation by a number of rural legislators in the state that said, don't let these state entities, these private entities, these quasi-public entities shut down water access because of a perceived position by the federal government, and that's what this bill fixes. Now, if the federal government comes in, to your point, sure, federal government can say nope, no access to this water, and then it would prompt some sort of preemption lawsuit or the like, meaning what controls here, state law or federal law. But right now, this solves a major problem and really puts access to cultivating hemp in the hands of the farmers where it should be.
Now that farm bill that you're talking about, that allowed states to create their own experimental and research hemp programs. Is Colorado a big participant in that program?
In fact, they're the largest hemp state in the country. There were 12,080 acres produced outdoors last year, and 1.2 million indoor square feet produced last year. Of those 12,000 acres, 9,000 were in Colorado. And of the indoor acreage, approximately 900,000 of those indoor square feet was in Colorado. So it's the most significant participant in the country under a hemp program that's deemed, Farm Bill compliant. And the Farm Bill, while it created it for research purposes only, the research was threefold: agricultural, scientific, and market research. And the sponsors of the legislation very clearly said that this was intended to create a commercial marketplace, because how can you study the effects of market research without a market? And that's where we get pushback from the DEA and the USDA. But so far, so good with the increase in acreage. We should have probably nationwide, we might have double what we had last year. We might have upwards of 25,000 acres outdoors this year.
Bob?
Yeah.
Let me jump in and
Sure.
ask you one question. You talked about a certain percentage of that was outdoor cultivation. A friend of mine is a legal licensed outdoor grower in the state of Washington. And the one thing I think they've always worried about, and I think others, is that if industrial hemp is being grown outdoors in the same general area as high-quality marijuana, won't it dilute the marijuana? Won't we end up with a less appealing, a less valuable crop on the marijuana side?
Absolutely.
So how do we deal with that? I'm not suggesting one has preference or the other. I'm just wondering how we handle that. On one hand, I hate to think that all marijuana for personal use has to be grown indoors, only because I'd love to see as many choices as possible. And some people think that marijuana grown out in the sunlight is the highest quality marijuana. On the other hand, I fully understand why you wouldn't want to invest tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars and have your crop destroyed by industrial hemp next door.
Correct. Now, that fact cuts both ways. Number one, it helps defeat law enforcement or government officials' arguments that hemp is simply subterfuge for marijuana.
I know. I always laugh at that.
That's a good one. In other words, you'd have crappy marijuana and crappy hemp if they cross-pollinate. But at the end of the day, I believe that access to appropriate varieties and genetics from institutes across Europe, for example, the Ukrainian Hemp Institute, Polish Hemp Institute, with those varieties, it's not. I wouldn't call them that they have the Monsanto effect, but they do have seeds that are certified such that they won't have an impact on marijuana plants. It's just we're not able to get those into the country on a commercial scale. But your point's well taken, and frankly, a number of universities are studying that exact issue.
Well, we only have time for about one more question, because I'd like to. I hate to give Jeff Sessions any more stage time than necessary, but the guy's absolutely reefer mad over cannabis. We can't even tell what he would do if he was unfettered. But when they passed the spending bill, Congress stripped the funding to pursue a drug war against state compliance cannabis companies, in keeping with the Cole Amendment.
Only medical, by the way, not recreational. Yeah.
So far, it's only been a lot of sound and not much fury. In fact, High Times even calls Sessions' bluster a phony marijuana war. But I got to wonder, if he doesn't have any money and he wants to pursue a crackdown, are there ways that he can do it? You could both comment.
Well, for one thing, what that amendment to the concurrent spending resolution did was preclude the DOJ from spending any money to enforce federal law in states where medical marijuana programs were compliant. But that still leaves 8 states totally out in the hinterland. And I also think that there are ways that state attorney generals might file an injunction and raise that same supremacy clause issue. In other words, it may be that there is some other federal agency that can raise it where it's not blocked by that spending resolution. So as much as I appreciate the fact that we have enough support in Congress now to apparently keep that resolution, and in fact there's even efforts being made to expand it to cover the recreational states, that seems to me like a Band-Aid. I think in the end, we've got to roll back federal law and make it clear that states determine marijuana policy the same way as we did when we ended alcohol prohibition. And that's going to take a few more years, to be honest. It's not 10 years off, but it might be 4 or 5 years off.
What do you think, Bob?
No, I agree with Keith 100%. The recreational, the adult use side of the marketplace is certainly exposed because there's no spending prohibition. And even if it were protected by something similar to that Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, which protects medical marijuana businesses, it doesn't prevent other agencies or other avenues of attack against these entities that are outside of, for example, the Controlled Substances Act. But let's also not forget, Sessions, as deplorable as he is as a human being, seemingly, and as deplorable as his policy positions are, he represents his constituents. He's a multi-term elected member of Congress as a senator. This is what his constituents want. And let's also not forget that his saber rattling is effectively consistent with, at least 35% of the American public out there. So that's why I believe it is just saber rattling. He's saying what his constituents want him to say. Unfortunately, he's tethered to the leadership of the Department of Justice, and that's the major problem.
Also, I think he is a true cultural warrior. He's one of these guys who's still fighting battles that were in the late 60s and the 70s that are not relevant to most Americans today. So I don't think he's just playing to his audience. He's certainly doing that. He seems to me to be a true believer, and he believes marijuana is indeed reefer madness.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Although, but we did read in the paper this morning that there appears to be a fracture. Between the president himself and Sessions, which began probably where Sessions, appropriately so, recused himself from the Russian investigation.
The Russia investigation. There's a whole episode.
By the way, we ought to come back and discuss cannabis ruderalis at some point.
Yes, at some point.
So anyway, yeah.
Well,
no, I was just going to say, so who knows, and apparently Trump found out about that recusal, not from Sessions himself. So I think that's where the divide began, but only time will tell.
Let me thank you guys for checking in with us, and I want to give a reminder to all our folks out there in Radio Land that you can send in your own questions for Keith or future guests or suggestions to the show via email by sending a letter to questions@KeithStroupShow.com. And we'll say something about you on the air. It'll probably even be nice things. For our listeners who out there wish that somebody would fight for marijuana reform in your hometown, you're right. And we're wishing that you'd be the guy to do it. So if you want to find out how you can join the movement, check out NORML's website. That's NORML.org. To learn more about Bob Hoban and the amazing work of the Hoban Law Group, check out Hoban.law. That's HOBAN.law. Anything else, guys?
No, other than let's all stay high.
Thanks again, Michael. Appreciate it. You guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you for joining us. I want to encourage our audience to listen to next week's show. I will be at the Southeast Cannabis Conference and Expo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We'll be doing live interviews. We might have an evergreen show with Keith talking about a variety of things if I can't get on the air at the right time, but we guarantee we're going to bring back scoops from Florida, and I don't just mean sand. So I want to thank our host, Keith Stroup, for joining us from National NORML headquarters in Washington, D.C. Super special thank yous to our guest this week, Bob Hoban, for fighting the good fight and taking the time to tell us about it. Be sure to tune in next week for the latest in marijuana news from Washington and around the world. Once again, this has been the Keith Stroup Show. I'm Michael Weisser, and you're listening to Cannabiz News. This week's episode of the Keith Stroup Show is sponsored by the Hoban Law Group. The nation's premier cannabis law firm, Hoban Law, is also the nation's only full-service cannabis business law group. Formed in 2009, Hoban Law has been Colorado's largest, most experienced cannabis business law firm and consistently provided expert commercial legal advice to its clients in the regulated marijuana dispensary system and the industrial hemp sector. As the burgeoning movement has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, HLG has grown with it. Now home to a national footprint of attorneys licensed in over a dozen states across the country, with the expertise to offer its clients one-stop shop for their rapidly expanding business legal needs. Call the Hoban Law Group at 303-674-7000 or visit them online at Hoban Law. That's HOBAN.law.